So, hi, Dr. John Whiteman. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Rachel. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. So the 27th, I hear marks Polar Bear Day. Obviously one of the most kind of widely known animals on Earth. But today I kind of wanted to focus on celebrating them as like amazing predators. So
Mhm.
for my first question, I wanted to ask, how do polar bears compare against other terrestrial predators in terms of size and ferocity?
Sure thing. Basically, nothing else compares. They're the largest terrestrial predator, the largest adult males. We actually don't know how big they get because we don't have equipment that's robust enough to be able to measure them in the wild. There aren't any other predators that on average come anywhere near their size. The closest we can get are some brown bear populations, which polar bears diverged from probably around 500,000 years ago. And in some parts of their range, brown bears that have access to really good food sources like salmon, they can come close to polar bear size. But on average, polar bears are the biggest.
Incredible. And they're obviously like really intelligent animals. So I was wondering if you could talk me through some of the kind of more sophisticated methods of hunting we've seen them doing.
Sure thing. Polar bear hunting is really a pretty spectacular thing to observe. It's very hard to observe, but there have been some great studies over the last couple decades in which researchers were able to go out and find polar bears that were consistently hanging out in one area and then be able to watch them for a long time period through a spotting scope or something like that. And the most common method of hunting that you see with polar bears is a sit and wait. So their primary prey are ring seals, which are coming up through holes in the Arctic sea ice to breathe. And a bear will find one of those holes. It will figure out that this is where the seal is going to be coming up. And then it will sit back just a little bit from the edge of that hole, and then it will remain perfectly motionless, sometimes for hours, waiting for that seal to come up. And it is ready to pounce at a moment's notice. As soon as that seal is within reach, it'll reach down and grab it. Another interesting thing you can observe sometimes is that polar bears will observe a seal at a distance that is basking, it's resting on the sea ice surface, and the polar bear will start to stalk it from a distance. Now, because this is the sea ice, there's no trees, there's no shrubs, there's no cover for the bears. So they will look for, piles of ice or snowbanks that they can kind of hide behind and slink forward. And sometimes if they can find a little patch of open water or perhaps a melt pond on top of the ice, the bear might drop down into the water. And then if you could imagine like I don't know, an underwater ninja creeping along as quietly and as still as possible without disturbing the water, it can use the water as cover to sneak up on the seal before jumping up and pouncing on the bear. Two other things that come up with hunting. It's pretty common in the spring for polar bears to smell under snow dens that the ring seals and other species of seals will use to give birth. And so the bear will be walking along on the surface of the snow. So you've got the sea ice here, then you've got snow on top of that, and the seal will come up through the ice and dig a little den or a little cave in the snow, and then give birth and then nurse its young inside that den. Polar bear will be walking along on top of the snow and will be able to smell and detect that there's prey underneath, and it will go up on the hind legs and then come down with force and pop through the roof of the den to catch the seal inside. And I haven't personally observed that, but what has happened is I've been flying along in the Arctic in a helicopter, and you look down and you'll see blood in the snow, and you'll land the helicopter and walk over, and you'll find the hole that the bear made in the roof of the den when it burst through to catch the seal. And then finally, a thing that's pretty interesting and worth mentioning, although it's really, from what we can tell, it's probably quite rare, is that there have been recorded accounts of polar bears seeming to use tools. That is, doing something like picking up a chunk of ice and throwing it at something like a walrus, which would be a really big prey item, pretty unusual for a polar bear to take. And potentially with the idea that that's kind of a weapon that can stun the animal that will make it easier for them to kill. So it's worth mentioning that. It's really interesting, but I would also say, with decades and decades of polar bear work in the Arctic and a lot of interviews with people who live in the Arctic, and there's been only a couple scattered reports of that happening.
Sounds like a pretty rough deal for the seals then. So,
It is, I would say something really interesting there is the seals that live in Antarctica have a completely different behavioral repertoire where when they're resting on the ice surface, they're not very jumpy. And I've never done this myself, but from what I understand, people who study seals in Antarctica, in some cases, you can basically just walk right up to the seal and put a little blindfold on it, and it will calm down, and then you can put a tracker on it or do whatever you need to do. And that's because there are no polar bears in Antarctica. So there's nothing on the surface of the sea ice that's going to come after them. In the Arctic, any seal that's on the sea ice surface, if it sees any motion, a mile away, it's out of there. It's going to split right away because they've evolved with that very scary threat of predation by polar bears.
The lottery of life for seals, I guess. You want to end up on
Yeah.
one pole, not the other.
Yep.
So once the polar bear has made its kill, what happens next? Does it sort of hang around and eat it all at once, or does it spread out the meal? How does it go?
So we have some really interesting observations there from some of the same studies that reported exactly how they stalk a seal. And that includes that a lot of the time, a polar bear, once it kills a seal, will actually specifically go after just the blubber. So they will use, and I think if I'm remembering the quote correctly from one of these published observations, they use their canines and incisors in a very exacting fashion, almost like a pair of scissors, to separate out the blubber from the skin and from the rest of the animal, and then consume the blubber. And that's because fat is really energy dense. It's got about twice as many calories per pound or per gram than other types of nutrients or other types of tissues do. So eating fat really gives the polar bears the most bang for their buck in terms of the energy that they can gain from a meal. And then in some cases, it's not that uncommon for polar bears to eat most of the blubber and then leave. They might just move on without even eating much of the rest of the seal, so they can maximize their opportunity to find the next seal and get the most energy dense part, again, the blubber, and then move on and get the next seal and the next seal and the next seal. So caching or storing food has been observed sometimes with polar bears. They might kill a seal, partially eat it, maybe bury it in the snow and then come back to it later. But honestly, that behavior is also really rare. It's not nearly as common as it is for some terrestrial bears like brown bears. So for the most part, a polar bear will kill the seal, have its meal right then, really focus on the fat, and then move on.
Okay, and on a good day when it's been hunting seals and eating the blubber like that, how long will that sustain it before it really needs to be finding another one?
It can depend a lot on time of year and the size of the bear, and especially if it's a female that has dependent cubs, because that's really energetically demanding to be producing milk for the cubs. But a rough rule of thumb would probably be like it needs one seal every 4 or 5 days, maybe up to a week. So about a seal a week is a good guess, a good place to start.
Cool. So from a zoological perspective, it's really easy to get so excited about all of these, intelligent hunting techniques and how fierce these animals are as predators. As a human being who could be vulnerable is less exciting. And as I understand it, Polar Bears International have been working on your bear doll that's meant to help reduce interactions between humans and bears. Is that right? Could you tell me a bit about it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there's a lot of communities in the Arctic, and there always have been. People have always lived in polar bear habitat. One of the things that's changing now is as we're losing sea ice, bears are being forced to spend more time on shore, which could increase the probability that they'll have an interaction with humans. And although polar bears, don't really target humans or anything, they are bears and they're predators. And so they will try and defend themselves, or they'll try and go for something they think they could eat. So it's really important to try and minimize those human polar bear interactions. And one of the best ways to minimize that is to figure out when a polar bear is approaching a human community so everybody can be warned. And if possible, maybe someone could go towards the polar bear and do things like make loud noises or send out some visual flares or something like that, that would scare the bear away so it doesn't even get into trouble by going into the town. So that raises the challenge of how do you detect a polar bear as it's coming towards a human community? And so PBI, along with a couple of collaborators, has been working on this bear radar or BEARDAR. And the idea there is to have some kind of low-level radar, not on a plane, but something mounted on a pole or a tall building, or perhaps a vehicle that's driving around, that is sweeping the nearby area and detecting all of the large objects that are moving in the area and figuring out which of those objects is potentially a bear. So there's a couple different pieces of the hardware that have had mixed success so far. Some of them have been really successful, some not as successful. And then the other piece that's really important is the software, because once you've had a detection, the question is that a polar bear or not? And so you don't want to have false positives. That is where you pick up something and you think, oh gosh, that's a polar bear, we need to send people out. And you get there and it turns out, to be a moose or to be a tree that was blowing in the wind or something. So in part, there's been some really neat collaboration to develop new pieces of hardware, and then developing the artificial intelligence or the software on the back end to sort out those detections is also a big area where advancement is happening right now. And the neat thing about PBI's involvement with this is that there's a real demand for this in the Arctic, and it can really help protect the bears in this on-the-ground immediate sense. But there isn't another group out there who's exclusively focused to polar bear conservation, management, and research that can kind of link together all the different interested parties to get that work done. So working with the communities, working with private companies who can really spur the innovation for this, and then also working with researchers who can help collect the data and then finalize the criteria to make sure that it's doing what we want it to do. So PBI kind of is the central hub for all of that, which is really useful.
Fantastic. And you mentioned there the retreating sea ice. How devastating is the loss of sea ice for polar bears when they're trying to hunt?
Sea ice is everything. If we don't have sea ice, we don't have polar bears. It's truly as simple as that. Polar bear fossils are pretty hard to find because they spend so much of their lives on sea ice. They often die on sea ice, and then the bones, of course, will just sink into the sea and you can't find them. But to the extent that we do have some fossil record of polar bears over the last several 100,000 years, where those fossils are distributed kind of wax and wane with where the sea ice is distributed. So we have very clear historical evidence, and then also everything we know about contemporary polar bear biology right now all tells us that polar bears are tied to regions that have a good chunk of the year in which there's persistent sea ice that seals are using and that bears can use as a platform to hunt seals. So as we lose the sea ice, bears lose hunting opportunities. And what we're seeing right now in real time is in some subpopulations, there's 19 subpopulations of polar bears, and each area has its own unique sea ice dynamics. So these changes they differ by which of those 19 areas we're talking about. But in the long run, we do expect, unless we stop climate change and sea ice loss, we're going to see the same thing in all 19 of those subpopulations. But what we see is that some of the first things that happen when we lose sea ice in an area is reduced survival of the cubs. We might see fewer cubs produced. And then we also see things like body mass or skull size, which is a nice metric for total size of a bear. Body mass and skull size decline for some of the adults or subadults in the population. And that ends up being especially critical when we lose body mass for adult females, because they're the bottleneck for keeping the population growing, because they're the ones producing the cubs. So when we lose body mass in adult females, that's really problematic because that can lead to reduced production and survival of cubs. And then that ultimately is what is going to lead to population declines.
Then this is another area where PBI are stepping in with the tech, I think, because you guys are working on this den detection stuff. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So another kind of on the ground immediate need in the Arctic is, as we're increasing human activity for a wide variety of reasons, including things like resource extraction, drilling, et cetera, there's a need to figure out where maternal dens occur for polar bears, because pregnant female polar bears will dig a den in autumn, usually in the snow, sometimes in the dirt, in a riverbank or something on land, but more frequently in the snow. They'll go into that den and they will remain in there. They'll go in anywhere between September to December, something like that. Once they get in, the fertilized egg that they have, which has been in this kind of state of suspended animation all summer long, it's this thing called delayed implantation, where after they mate, the egg starts to develop. And once it reaches a couple hundred cells, it just stops. And it just goes into the suspended animation. It's not developing anymore. Once the female, around the time she enters the den, that egg kickstarts again, it implants, and she finishes her pregnancy. Then she gives birth, usually sometime December, January, around then, but they stay in the den. And so that's one reason why we have International Polar Bear Day during this time of year, because it represents a time of year when the cubs have all been born and they're still safely tucked away in their den before they emerge in the spring. So this is a really critical time period for polar bears where the cubs are born, they're only a couple pounds, they're small, and they're nursing and they're growing very rapidly, and they're not ready for the outside world. So it's really critical to to identify and then protect the dens during this time of year to make sure that we're not disturbing them with nearby human activity. So there were some early efforts over the last 20, 30 years to try and detect polar bear dens in the snow by aircraft, low-flying aircraft, using something called FLIR, or forward-looking infrared. And so that's a kind of detection device that depends on the emission of heat. And it had mixed success, but it would miss a lot of dens. And so right now, this is another thing where PBI is kind of a central hub, pulling together different collaborators, different private companies, and really spurring innovation to develop a different technique that has a higher success rate. So one thing that is really promising is something called SAR, or synthetic aperture radar, which so far seems to do a much better job of detecting those dens below the surface. So one of the things that's happening right now is PBI has some really interesting work going on in Svalbard, this really amazing archipelago of islands way up there in the Arctic, part of Norway, with some known locations of polar bear dens. And PBI is setting out these cameras at a distance to observe the dens, so we know when it is the female and the cubs come out in spring and start to become active, and then eventually leave the area and go back out on the sea ice. And we can also use those known locations of dens to test things like synthetic aperture radar. And then once we've got a lot of success consistently with one method, that's something that private companies or government agencies or whoever's being really active in the Arctic, they can employ that technology to figure out where dens are and then reroute their activity or change the timing of their activity or whatever they need to do to protect those areas to maximize the chance that those cubs will survive.
Fantastic. It's like very sad to hear about how such a deadly predator can be struggling, but then amazing to hear about all of these technological advances that could help them along the way.
Polar bears, I always think of them as kind of a little bit of a paradox because they're the largest terrestrial predator. They're phenomenally robust animals. One really interesting kind of physiological thing is we don't actually know how cold it has to get for a polar bear to shiver. So there's something called the lower critical temperature, and that's the temperature at which an animal can no longer maintain its body heat just by normal physiological processes, and it has to start activating its muscles to stay warm. So obviously we humans, if we're outside without a jacket, and it's 10 degrees Celsius or 5 degrees Celsius or 20 or 30 or something like that, Fahrenheit, then we obviously start to shiver. So we know what that is like. We have a pretty high lower critical temperature. For polar bears, they've been observed under different kind of controlled conditions and in the wild, and we haven't seen one shiver yet. So we don't know how cold it has to get. So they're these amazingly robust animals, really well adapted to their home in the Arctic. On the other hand, because they are so well adapted to that sea ice Arctic environment, it actually leaves them quite vulnerable to changes in that habitat. So at the same time, they're this really robust animal, but they're also quite kind of a fragile and vulnerable species.
Amazing. There's two things I've never considered before: the polar bear shiver and why there's so few polar bear fossils. So
Yeah,
thank you for an eye-opening chat for Polar Bear Day. Thanks so much for your time.
absolutely. Happy to do it.